Peter Parker, better known to the world as Spider-Man, had faced many challenges in his life.
From battling notorious villains in New York City to balancing the demands of his everyday life, he had always found a way to protect the people he cared about. But when an unexpected event forced Peter to relocate to Chicago, he found himself in unfamiliar territory.
Chicago was different from New York.
The city had its own rhythm, its own energy. The towering skyscrapers, bustling streets, and iconic landmarks like the Willis Tower and Navy Pier gave it a unique character. But for Peter, the windy city felt like a maze of challenges waiting to be unraveled.
New York had been his home, the place where he knew every rooftop and alleyway.
But here, in Chicago, everything felt foreign. The city had its own share of crime and corruption, and Peter quickly realized that he would need to start from scratch to establish himself as Chicago's new protector.
Despite the new environment, Peter was determined to make the best of it.
He had come to Chicago to escape the chaos that had engulfed his life in New York,
to find some peace and maybe even start fresh. But as Spider-Man, he knew that trouble was never far behind.
It didn't take long for trouble to find him.
As Peter settled into his new life, reports of a mysterious figure began to circulate in the city.
This figure, known only as the Shadow, had been terrorizing Chicago's criminal underworld, taking down gang leaders and corrupt officials with ruthless efficiency. But the Shadow wasn't a hero. He was a vigilante who operated in the darkness, with no regard for the law. The people of Chicago were divided in their opinions. Some saw the Shadow as a necessary force in a city plagued by corruption, while others feared his methods and the chaos he brought with him.
The police were at a loss, unable to track down the elusive figure who seemed to disappear as quickly as he appeared.
Peter knew he couldn't stand by and let the Shadow continue his reign of terror.
But in a city where he was still finding his footing, the task seemed daunting.
The Shadow was no ordinary criminal. He was highly skilled, with a network of informants and allies that made him nearly impossible to catch.
But Peter was Spider-Man, and he had faced worse odds before.
He began to investigate the Shadow, using his skills and instincts to gather information.
But as he delved deeper into the mystery, he realized that the Shadow was not just another criminal. He was something far more dangerous. One evening, as the sun set over the Chicago skyline, Peter's instincts told him that something was about to happen.
He suited up as Spider-Man and swung through the city, his senses heightened as he scanned the streets below.
It wasn't long before he spotted something unusual. A group of armed men were gathered in an alleyway, their faces tense as they exchanged harsh words.
Peter's spider sense tingled. These men were up to no good.
He watched from the shadows as they discussed their plan, their voices filled with fear and urgency.
They were waiting for someone they called the Shadow.
Peter's heart raced as he realized that this was his chance to confront the mysterious figure.
As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the alley grew thicker. And then, without warning, the Shadow appeared. He moved like a ghost, his figure barely visible in the dim light. The armed men recoiled in fear as the Shadow approached, his voice low and menacing. "You've failed me," the Shadow hissed, his words sending a chill down Peter's spine. "And you know what happens to those who fail." The men begged for mercy, but the Shadow was unforgiving.
Before Peter could react, the Shadow struck with lightning speed, taking down the men with precision.
It was over in seconds, and the Shadow began to disappear into the night. Peter knew he had to act quickly.
He swung down from his perch, landing in the alleyway just as the Shadow was about to escape.
"Hold it right there," Peter called out, his voice echoing of the walls. The Shadow turned, his eyes narrowing as he sized up Spider-Man.
"You must be the new hero in town," the Shadow said, his voice dripping with disdain.
"But this is my city now." Peter didn't hesitate. He lunged at the Shadow, his web shooters firing as he tried to subdue the vigilante. But the Shadow was quick, dodging the webs with ease. The two clashed in the alleyway, their movements a blur of speed and agility.
Despite his best efforts, Peter found himself outmatched.
The Shadow was unlike any opponent he had faced before. His attacks were precise, his movements unpredictable. And just when Peter thought he had the upper hand, the Shadow slipped away, disappearing into the darkness as if he had never been there. Breathing heavily, Peter realized that he had underestimated the Shadow. This was no ordinary fight, and if he was going to protect the city, he would need to up his game.
The encounter with the Shadow left Peter shaken but determined. He knew he needed to learn more about this new adversary if he had any hope of stopping him.
Over the next few days, Peter devoted himself to researching the Shadow, Piecing together clues from the city's criminal underworld, he discovered that the Shadow was not working alone. He had connections with several powerful crime families in Chicago, using them to extend his influence across the city. The Shadow's goal was clear: to take control of Chicago's criminal empire, and to do it with ruthless efficiency.
But Peter also uncovered something more troubling.
The Shadow's methods were becoming increasingly violent, and his attacks were leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. Innocent people were getting caught in the crossfire, and the city was beginning to unravel. Peter knew he had to act quickly. He devised a plan to lure the Shadow into a trap, using his knowledge of the city's criminal networks to his advantage. It was risky, but Peter was willing to take the chance if it meant stopping the Shadow once and for all. He began by spreading rumors among the criminal underworld, hinting at a major deal going down in one of the city's abandoned warehouses.
The bait was set, and all Peter had to do was wait.
On the night of the operation, Peter positioned himself on the rooftop of the warehouse, his eyes scanning the streets below. The minutes ticked by, and Peter's nerves were on edge.
But then, just as he had hoped, the Shadow appeared.
The vigilante moved silently through the shadows, his eyes focused on the warehouse. Peter watched as the Shadow approached, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for.
But just as Peter was about to spring his trap, something went wrong.
The Shadow stopped in his tracks, his head snapping up as if he sensed Peter's presence. Peter's spider sense went off like a siren, warning him that something was terribly wrong.
Before Peter could react, the Shadow vanished into the darkness, leaving Peter alone on the rooftop. A split second later, the warehouse exploded in a ball of fire, the force of the blast knocking Peter off his feet. As Peter struggled to regain his footing, he realized that the Shadow had outsmarted him. The explosion was a distraction, a way to throw Peter off his trail.
And now, the Shadow was one step ahead. Peter knew he couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. The Shadow was getting more dangerous by the day, and the city was running out of time.
But Peter was determined to stop him, no matter the cost. He spent the next few days tracking the Shadow's movements, using every resource at his disposal.
Finally, Peter discovered the Shadow's true plan: to assassinate the city's mayor during a high-profile event at Millennium Park. The event was only hours away, and Peter knew he had to act fast. He suited up as Spider-Man and made his way to Millennium Park, his mind racing as he thought of how to stop the Shadow. The park was filled with people, the air buzzing with excitement, but Peter's spider sense was on high alert, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of the Shadow.
He knew the vigilante would strike soon, and he had to be ready. As the mayor took the stage to speak, Peter spotted a figure moving through the crowd.
It was the Shadow. His eyes locked on the mayor as he drew a weapon from his coat.
Peter's heart raced as he realized he had only seconds to act. With a burst of speed, Peter swung down from a nearby building, his whip shooters firing as he aimed for the Shadow.
The vigilante reacted instantly, dodging the web and turning to face Spider-Man. The two clashed in the center of the park, their battle sending the crowd into a panic. Peter fought with everything he had, determined not to let the Shadow succeed. But the vigilante was relentless, his attacks fueled by a desire for power and control. As the battle raged on, Peter realized that the only way to stop the Shadow was to outsmart him. He feigned weakness, allowing the Shadow to land a blow that sent Peter crashing to the ground. The Shadow moved in for the kill, his weapon raised as he prepared to finish Spider-Man once and for all.
But just as he was about to strike, Peter sprang into action, using his whip to disarm the vigilante and deliver a powerful blow that sent the Shadow flying.